Good afternoon, my name is Olga Tamanova, and it's my pleasure to see everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center, Ukraine 4. It's year 10 of the war, and today is day 576 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And now we will be talking about the results of the latest sessions of the Parliament of Ukraine. Joining us in line is Fedir Venislavskyi, People's Deputy of Ukraine, member of the Parliamentary Committee on National Security, Defense and Intelligence, representative of the President of Ukraine to Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. Good afternoon, Mr. Fedir. Good afternoon. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Mr. Fedir, lately there were a lot of decisions taken with regard to the draft laws. We have a lot to talk about. So let's start with the State Budget 2024. Let's talk about the articles that will be allocated the biggest funding next year. Yeah, in full compliance with the Constitution of Ukraine, the Parliament, within the term stipulated by the law on the state budget of Ukraine, submitted the draft law to be considered on the 20th of September by the Parliament of Ukraine, and the Minister of Finance presented it. Very good name of the draft law, from the budget of war to the budget of victory and growth of economy. To me, it's very important to consider the sphere of the national security, defense and intelligence. It's my pleasure to see that the deputies see it as a priority to be funded. The funding is at the same level, a little bit increased for the next year. I would like to remind you that the last year state budget law had an unprecedentedly high level of funding for the sector of national security and defense. So if we see the expense articles, all the money that Ukraine was collecting from internal resources were forwarded at the defense and security sector, and this year this trend is preserved. In fact, all of the proceeds of the state budget that are planned in the draft law are aimed at the sector of defense and security. Other articles will be funded from external sources, from our foreign donors. Unfortunately, is the war going on, and the President, along with the Parliament and the Cabinet of Ministers, pay the most attention to the sector of defense and security. Now that we're waging the full-scale war, those predicted proceeds of the budget and the expanded of the state budget, along with the growth of the GDP plan for the year 2024, are supposed to be achieved, and the next year we achieve the growth of GDP of at least 5%, which is a good forecast given the full-scale war going on. The state still keeps its attention on keeps its focus on the social support, and we would like to emphasize the support of the veterans of war that we currently increase many times so that they feel protected. There are also allocations for the state of science and education. Comparing to the last year, there is more funding allocated for those articles, but still we have to win the war first and then to allocate funding for the recovery of economy. And this is why the draft law of the state budget for year 2024 is very well weighed. It's supported by all the political forces represented in the parliament, and I think after we consider it and adopt it, there will be remarks and some amended, but in my opinion it's very well balanced and it's good for the pending approval. Thank you very much, Mr. Fedir. Another draft law that was intensely discussed in our society is the law on electronic declarations. We know that they are going to be disclosed again. So what are the stepping stones there? We know that the declarations will not be open for all the categories of population. So what are the restrictions that are still in place? Yes, very important is the second decision approved by the Parliament. They took into account the veto of the President to the law on electronic declarations. The President insisted that all of the declarations of the officials, of the government officials, ministers, and all the officials whose activity is related to the high risks of abuse, to make sure that the declarations of such politically exposed persons are easily accessible, are in open source. And given the fact that the Ukraine is waging the war, the representatives of the armed forces whose activity is related to the risk to their lives and health, they will not have their declarations open, but all of the government officials will have their declarations open 24/7. There are also certain restrictions with regard to the persons living in the temporarily occupied territories, like the local government officials and the central government officials. The requirement for the 24/7 open access to the electronic declarations will not cover them either, so those restrictions are quite justified in my opinion. The Parliament supported the proposal of the President, and the demand of the society that was submitted in the electronic petition was taken into account, and we demonstrated the consolidated approach on part of the President and parliamentary majority to this important issue, and the society will be able to get access and to see whose estates have grown during the war, who acquired some additional benefits, and who was spending their money to for the sector of security and defense. Mr. Fedir, there were more draft laws with regard to European integration that are specified in the context of our future Euro integration, specifically the draft law on lifelong compliance of politically exposed persons and the draft law on national minorities. Let's talk about both of these drafts. Let's probably start with compliance. Yes, those are the two important draft laws that the Parliament approved yesterday. First is about the compliance, the amendments to some laws on countering the money laundering and proliferation of the mass destruction weapons. And as to the politically exposed persons, such as ministers and people's deputies, they are politically exposed persons, and there is a risk-oriented approach applied against or in relation to them. If someone was ever elected a people's deputy of Ukraine, they preserve this statute until the end of their lives. The banks, they should take into account that such persons had access to the government resources, to the state resources, that they could use the government service benefits to take these or those decisions. This is why the adoption of this law was something that the European Union was waiting from us. If a person becomes a government official, they preserve this status until the end of their life. They have the risk-oriented approach applied to them, and this is what we do to our officials. Another draft law we were going to adopt is the draft law on the national minorities. It's a it's a complex law because there was a discussion with the parliamentaries, with the government officials, when the representatives of the European Commission, the Venetian Commission on the rule of law, was coming to Ukraine. You know, the issue about the Russian-speaking national minority is not quite clear to them why Ukraine regulates their rights in that way, but we're saying that Russian Federation was using some fabricated premises to accuse Ukraine on violation of Russian-speaking minorities. So in that draft law, we took into account that fact that Ukraine is waging the full-scale war against Russian Federation, who attacked us, and the national minorities, the Russian-speaking national minorities, do not have as much preferences as other minorities have, but still this draft law is of immense meaning to European integration. The People's Deputies supported it, so I think we've done a little bit of homework to make sure that Ukraine becomes a full-fledged member of the European Union, and I hope in October the door will open not for negotiations on candidacy status, but on full-fledged membership status. So yesterday and the day before, the Parliament of Ukraine has made two civilizational choices that was mentioned during the voting of People's Deputies. We've picked the European future for our country. Mr. Fedir, I think that Hungary was very sensitive in relation to this draft law. Is it safe to say that this draft law will support the development of our relations, or it has some complex things containing that will complicate the things between two of our countries? Well, talking about Hungary and Romania, it's a different track, because given the presence of ethnic minorities in Transcarpathian region and Romanian minority in Chernivtsi region, there are some additional expectations from the representatives of the governments of those countries. The delegation of Cabinet of Ministers with the committees of the Parliament was in negotiations with Hungarian side. I think we found, so to say, points of contact, and on top of that law on national minorities, there will be more legislative initiatives submitted, and we will discuss them with the account of expectations of Hungarian and Romanian ethnic minorities, with the account of opinion of the government of those countries, who will support or not support Ukraine on track of its European integration. The President and the Parliament already work on such legislative initiatives, but it's too premature to say that we've taken into account the interests of all the national minorities. Thank you very much. I cannot help but asking about the changes in the management of the committees of the Parliament. What is the status of the Committee on the Freedom of Speech? What are the further steps to be taken in this area? Since Mr. Shufrij, the head of the Parliamentary Committee on Freedom of Speech, was detained, the Parliament adopted his revocation from that office. Now his deputy Mr. Stefan is in charge of the heading the committee. I think we will have consultations on the level of the Parliament to understand who will be entitled or who will be nominated to become the head of this parliamentary committee. This process is already underway. The committee keeps operating with the account of modern realities, but I think the head of the committee will be voted during the next meeting. Let's give the floor to our colleagues. Good afternoon, Svetlana Tkachuk, Ukrinform. Mr. Fedir, I have one question to you. The head of parliamentary fraction of Servants of People, David Arahami, stated that the parliament have fulfilled all the requirements to enter in negotiations on accession to European Union. Are there any more things the parliament should do in this area to start the accession process? Yes, there are still some matters to be worked on. Now different fractions continue considering different legislative initiatives. The European Union wants us to improve the activity of specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office. Also, what they expect is the legislative innovations in the area of lobbyism, lobbyist activity. It's not a popular term in Ukraine, but all the modern Western countries, they legalize the lobbyism activity, putting it within the legal framework. And within Parliament, we have a number of draft laws developed, and a number of them were registered, which integrate all the issues in this regard. Also, we should consider the matter of funding of the political parties and influence of oligarchs. There are amendments to anti-monopoly legislation of Ukraine. This work is still underway, but before we start the process of negotiations on accession to European Union, the Parliament should have all those critical recommendations fulfilled, and nothing will become an obstacle to this process. Do we have any more questions on the floor? Because I have one, Mr. Fedir, I would like to ask you about the cancellation of necessity of the State Audit Service to provide opinion for military procurement. Will it reinforce our businesses who work in the area of defense and security, who manufacture the products which are of the biggest importance right now? It's a very important legislation that was adopted by the Parliament yesterday. They deem it unacceptable when any businesses who fulfill the defense contract for the government, that in the opinion of State Audit Service they should work without profits, is the direct way to bankruptcy. It means that they would not be able to fulfill the orders submitted by our armed forces and other security and defense forces of Ukraine. That's why that political statement adopted by the Parliament yesterday, it sends a very important signal that the Parliament, the Committee for the National Security, Defense and Intelligence, keeps control of this matter. We've had a number of closed meetings. Yes, really, there are some problems with the reading of the wording of the decree of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, which looks a little bit surprising to me, because Cabinet of Ministers is supposed to be interested in expansion of capabilities of modern manufacturers who would be capable of providing our armed forces with everything they need. So there are disputes between the Ministry of Defense and the State Audit Service as to the disputing of their opinion. I think it will be done in the courts now, with account of other legislative acts, specifically tax legislation, legislation of entrepreneurship activity, and will finally put a period in such an incomprehensible approach by the State Audit Service during wartime. I think that both Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine and the society have heard the signals that the Parliament sends to them in such an important area as the security and defense sector. We have more questions on the floor, please.
Yes, hello, good morning. This is Mattia Bagnoli, correspondent for ANSA, the National Italian News Agency. I would like to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more on the specific provision that this new draft law has on the Russian minorities, and if you think that, what this new chapter provides, basically, and if you think that this is going to be enough for moving the issue forward with the European Union and the Venice Commission. Thanks.
Thank you for your question. As I mentioned, this draft law takes into account the European standards in the area of legal protection of the national minorities. In Ukraine, we have adopted those developments that our partners shared with us, and I think from the point of view of general understanding, the rights of the national minorities in Ukraine are very well protected in Ukraine on a legislative level. The Ukrainian legislation has direct imperative standards on protection of the national minorities. Talking about the Russian-speaking minorities, given the number of legislative initiatives adopted by the Parliament on ban of Russian or printing of Russian editorials, Russian books, study in Ukraine in Russian language, it's a very sensitive matter for Ukraine, given the fact that Russia used fabricated arguments to justify its invasion of Ukraine in year 2014 and the full-scale war in year 2022. So those guarantees for the national minorities, they contain certain restriction for Russian-speaking national minorities. And after our negotiation with the governments of Hungary and Romania, who have higher expectations, the matter of legal protection of the national minority will not be an obstacle on the way of accession of Ukraine to European Union. Mr. Fedir, another question is about the grain export. Maybe you have any news in this area. Well, I don't have any specific news in this area apart from the fact that we hope that even without consent of Russia to move in Ukrainian vessels to global markets, it's important for us to secure our vessels from the influence of the Black Sea fleet. But in the view of the latest actions of Ukrainian security and defense sector against the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, their capabilities are minimized, but still they are the problem. And no matter what is the position of Russia, United Nations and our European partners are supposed to intrude in this process because the safety of navigation is protected by naval conventions, no matter how Russia sees it. So this process is underway. I think there will be good news in this area because the president and the government continue working on this issue. Thank you very much for joining our broadcast. Dear colleagues, joining us was Fedir Venislavskyi, People's Deputy of Ukraine, member of the Parliamentary Committee on National Security, Defense and Intelligence, representative of the President of Ukraine to Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. Our next briefing is at 13 o'clock. We will be talking about the situation in the south of Ukraine. Joining us will be the head of the United Coordinating Press Center of Security and Defense Forces of the south of Ukraine, Natalia Akumenuk. Stay tuned. Let's continue working for our victory. Let's thank our security and defense forces, and glory to Ukraine.